Otto von Bismarck, Germany's former chancellor, widely considered to be the unifier of Germany itself, spoke once in 1888 towards the end of his life. One day, the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. He would be proven correct only 30 years later, predicting the events that would thrust the entire globe into a state of total war. I want to first emphasize that this period of history that I'm about to delve into is super complex and super information dense, so I'm going to try and trim it down as much as possible. Now, to really understand the complexity of this topic and this part of history, we gotta first go back about 100 or so years to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, Austria-Hungary at that time had a lot of issues, but its biggest came from its ethnic backgrounds. I mean, seriously, look at this cultural map of Austria-Hungary at its height. It's insanity. Despite this, the ruling Habsburg dynasty had maintained a strong hold on the empire for hundreds of years now. Franz Ferdinand, not that one, this one, was the Archduke of Austria and heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He advocated for greater autonomy between the numerous ethnic groups within Austria-Hungary, which he believed could only be achieved through granting administrative autonomy to all the people within the monarchy. I want to emphasize that this doesn't make Franz a good person. He actually considered Hungarians, Slavs, and Jews to be inferior to Austrians. He simply wanted to do this to preserve the longevity of the empire. This was a very radical idea, as a lot of the Habsburgs wanted to maintain the balance of power that they had been holding over Austria for hundreds of years now. Needless to say, this, combined with his marriage to his low-born wife, put him at odds with the rest of the members of the Habsburgs, especially with his uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph I, resulting in hostile arguments due to conflicts of interest and not being able to see eye to eye. One servant during this period even reported that, quote, thunder and lightning always raged during their discussions. Not exactly the ideal uncle-nephew relationship. So there was a lot of tension between Franz and much of the other aristocracy. Despite his difficult relationship both with the Austrian courts and other Habsburgs though, by 1914 he was still next in line to inherit the throne. Franz Joseph I was 84, so the throne would likely pass to him given another decade at most. Franz Ferdinand must have felt like his succession to the throne was more or less a guarantee. His rule was practically all but assured, and all he had to do was wait. It was early that same year that the Archduke and Archduchess announced their plan to visit Sarajevo on June 28th. Elsewhere, a couple hundred miles away in Belgrade, a young Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip showed the newspaper of the royal couple's planned visit to Sarajevo to two other friends. The day the royals had chosen to arrive at was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which is basically like the United States' Battle of Saratoga during the Revolutionary War, but for Serbia. To them, this oppressive sign of Austrian nobility arriving in a Serbian city on a day of national pride was a humiliating blow to the Serb nationalists. Had the Archduke chosen any other day, it's quite possible World War I may just have never happened. It was highly unlikely that he had any idea the significance of his arrival on this specific day. But for his ignorance, the Archduke and his wife would pay the ultimate price, and the first domino would fall. Franz and Sophie would arrive on Sarajevo on June 28th as planned, and would proceed down the expected route that had been published some time ago now, so anyone could catch a view of the royal couple on their tour through Sarajevo. A small parade had even been put together for their highly anticipated arrival. Unknown to anyone, those young Serbian nationalists from before had become a team of 6 would-be assassins. All had lined up and down the route the royal couple were planning to take, intent on killing the Archduke. These young Serbian men were members of Young Bosnia, a lesser part of the very forebodingly named Black Hand, a group who were no strangers to regicide. When I say young, by the way, I mean that only one of these guys in this group was over 20. Most of them were basically teenagers. A bunch of angry, patriotic young men and teens who wanted their people to be free of Austrian oppression. With this in mind, their incredibly bold decision makes a bit more sense, though obviously it doesn't excuse their actions taken that day. Despite these young men scattered throughout the procession, the couple continued on their route entirely without issue. The first two of the assassins had lost their nerve and fled the scene. Another felt pity after having seen the Archduke's wife, not able to bring himself to pull the trigger. Either way, One after another, the assassins failed their task. Nobody in the car or cars surrounding that couple were any the wiser. Until finally, someone tried. As the couple crossed a bridge, a grenade was launched from the crowd towards Franz Ferdinand and his wife. The archer caught sight of it just moments before it struck him and dove down into the car. The grenade is soaring overhead and exploding underneath the car behind them in the procession. Many people were wounded in the ensuing explosion as a car carrying both Franz and Sophie sped off and disappeared into the city. Gavrilo had witnessed this terrible failure from his comrades and was heartbroken, watching as all the cars sped past his position. He believed their chance at restoring Bosnia-Herzegovinian sovereignty was finished. He retreated deeper into the city, looking to evade capture by leaving the area where the attempt occurred. Deeper into the city, the shaken Archduke and his wife spoke with Sarajevo's mayor while they decided on what to do about the rest of the trip. The mayor wanted them to continue along the pre-agreed route, and I imagine Franz probably said something along the lines of, "Are you out of your mind?" Instead, Franz, in a surprising show of selflessness, opted to go and visit the hospital where many of the wounded were being held to check in on those who were injured, and this was agreed upon. So they all hopped back into their cars and went on toward the hospital. Unfortunately, the chauffeur-driver was a Hungarian man. He didn't know his way around Sarajevo, and even if he did, he couldn't speak or read neither German nor Serbian. Nobody had remembered to tell the driver of the new plans, and so he had taken a wrong turn down a side street. Realizing this, Franz would quickly get his aide, who spoke Hungarian, to inform the driver. While the driver tried to back out, the car stalled. All of those within were speaking to each other, not knowing that they were parked only 5 feet in front of Gavrilo Princip, who was eating a sandwich. Not wishing to lose another chance, Princip stepped forward and drew his pistol. It only took 2 shots for the course of history to be changed forever. All who participated in the assassination were arrested and tried, all of them either dying in prison or serving their sentences years down the line. Despite the serious implications of these events were realized by many, it wasn't immediately made out that a massive war would spawn from this, but over the course of 1 month, that would all change. Within just 2 days of the assassination, German and Austro-Hungarian diplomats quickly requested investigations of the assassins and the plot in Serbia, but were quickly stonewalled. After all, the Serbian government had denied any involvement in the assassination. Intense discussions followed within Austria-Hungary, as many ministers viewed this assassination as a challenge to the nation and had to be avenged, with Konrad von Hutzendorf being the primary leader of this war party. Austria's power had been diminishing over the past 50 years, and many warmongers viewed this as a chance to reclaim their former glory. Konrad himself wanted to declare war on Serbia in retaliation as soon as possible, saying, quote, "If you have a poisonous adder at your heel, you stamp on its head. You don't wait for it to bite." Their opinion on what to do in Vienna was hotly contested, as people argued for and against declaring war against the Serbs. Despite this, by the end of the week, not only had the warmongers gathered enough support to tip the scale in their favor, but Austria-Hungary had a direct guarantee of German support with a blank check, which could be called in if war actually broke out between the two countries, fortifying the alliance between the two German-led nations. A German ambassador to Vienna went so far as to say, "Germany will support the monarchy through thick and thin, whatever action it decided to take against Serbia. The sooner Austria-Hungary struck, the better." Convinced that threats via both Russian Balkan expansionism and Serbian nationalism were causing the empire a slow and agonizing decay, many of the warhawks in the dual monarchy believed a surprise war with a significantly smaller Serbia would be enough to restore Austro-Hungarian prestige. It should be noted that there wasn't exactly a plan to go about invading Serbia, by the way. They just wanted to declare war. They hadn't even accounted for the idea that Russia would even bother joining due to their ongoing modernization efforts, so they thought it would be a non-factor in the crisis. The decision-making on what to do about this crisis took 3 long weeks, at which point Austria-Hungary had lost the possible element of surprise and the reflex sympathy that would be expected from such a tragic event. This very much gave the impression to the Entente that Austria-Hungary was just trying to use the assassination as a pretext to war, something that they correctly assumed. Attempts at peace were promptly quelled, however, as many reasoned that going for the peaceful solution would result in the disbandment of the German dual alliance between the two partnering nations. This would have been catastrophic, as it was basically Austria-Hungary's last lifeline in Europe. so many reasoned that swift, decisive military action was necessary to restore their prestige. By this point, it was becoming more and more clear that there was possibly war on the horizon, and nations began mobilizing their armies in preparatory responses. Both Serbia and Austria-Hungary mobilized between the 24th and 25th, and France began preparations to defend their nation against a possible German invasion. The demands that were levied against the Serbs were utterly maddening, as the demands themselves practically were asking the Serbians to give up their autonomy to Austria-Hungary. The Serbian regent who presided over the reading of the demands, quote, expressed great despair over the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum, compliance with which he regards as an absolute impossibility for a state which had the slightest regard of dignity. Despite this, both French and Russian ministers pressured Serbia to accept the ultimatum due to neither France nor Russia being prepared for a war against Germany in 1914. So, a brilliant diplomatic maneuver was made by the Serbian government. The response from the Serbians was done so that it seemed like they were going to concede to the ultimatum in its entirety. In reality, this was a highly perfumed rejection on most points. It was more or less a checkmate against the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum and put pressure back onto the Austro-Hungarians regarding the possible conflict. Even the author of the first draft of the ultimatum said it was the most brilliant specimen of diplomatic skill that he had ever encountered. Elsewhere in Europe, France backed up their ally Russia as a general war suddenly now seemed to be dangerously looming over the horizon. It's at this point that there are a lot of moving parts once the crisis officially began on the 24th, so like I said at the start of the video, I'll probably be skipping over some things that I may or may not elaborate more on in a future video. The Balkan crisis at this point had devolved into a full-blown international crisis. Russia began partial mobilization in retaliation to try and deter ongoing German and Austro-Hungarian mobilization, but the dominoes had already begun to fall faster and faster. Germany and Austria-Hungary basically wanted a war to happen, but Germany wanted to prove their status as a new great power themselves, and Austria-Hungary wishing to reclaim old glory. The Central Powers seemed dead set on their goal of war against Europe. This put a ton of pressure onto Nicholas, who already was being viewed as a weak ruler, so he decided to put the full mobilization order back up, unknowingly signing the death sentence of the Russian Empire. At this rate, war almost seemed to be an inevitability, with Russian mobilization being treated across Europe as the unofficial sign that war was now inevitable. Early on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary levied an official declaration of war against the Kingdom of Serbia and swiftly began to bombard the city of Belgrade, and thus thrusting the entire globe into a state of total war for the next 4 years. Without this war, there's likely no Stalin or Hitler, no rise of fascism or the Second World War. We wouldn't see the Cold War that followed or the world being brought to the very precipice of nuclear annihilation, nor would we likely witness the Middle East getting carved up by bitter old men. Without this war, current history would probably look a lot different from how it does now. Fate simply had a different hand to deal the world. During my research for this video, I found a very interesting man named Harry Patch, one of the last surviving World War I veterans, one of the few soldiers from the war that fought from 1914 to 1918. He had this to say about the devastating conflict. When the war ended, I don't know if I was more relieved that we'd won or that I didn't have to go back. Passchendaele was a disastrous battle. Thousands of young lives were lost. It makes me angry. To me, it's a license to go out and murder. Why should the British government call me up and take me out to a battlefield to shoot a man I never knew, whose language I couldn't speak? All those lives lost for a war finished over the table. Now what is the sense in that? Unfortunately, rulers and politicians struggle to learn from their actions. Not even 20 years later, the survivors of the First World War would be forced to watch the world was plunged into yet another war, more disastrous and cataclysmic than the last. Parts of France that saw the most devastating fighting are still uninhabitable due to lead poisoning the ground and still live bombs buried underneath the ground. Tragically, many ongoing wars can be traced all the way back to this period of history and the issues that these great empires caused during their zenith and collapses. I've often wondered what may have happened had World War I been avoided, or at the very least what would have happened under different circumstances. But regardless of what we wish, history has already been written. We're made to live with the actions we've made. The past is the past because there's no changing it.
All we could do is live with the consequences of our actions and try to make the world a better place. Not just for us, but for the millions of people who perished in this war and the wars that followed as a result. Lest we forget.